Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be with you today. Uh, I left NASA about 13, 14 years ago, and a few times every year I go down to the Kennedy Space Center. I'm one of the astronauts that are there, 365 days a year. We've got crew members there. And I always enjoy coming down there, both to visit the facilities, to see the history there, to return to the place where I launched to space. And I also love coming there because I like the idea of inspiring that next generation. And that's really an important part of what we do at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex. So I want to share with you a little bit, maybe talk for 25, 30 minutes here about some of my experiences and just share with you about, what it's like to live and work up in space. So I always start with this picture. I was just in kindergarten, 6 years old, when the first American astronaut launched into space. That was a long time ago, nearly 60 years ago, May 5th, 1961. And in my elementary school in Cleveland, Ohio, they brought us all to our gymnasium. I sat on the floor, watched a small black and white TV of the launch. And as soon as our astronaut was in space, I remember sitting there saying, I want to do that. So ever since I was a little boy, I knew I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to ride a rocket to space. I wanted to experience zero gravity floating around up there. So I always knew what I wanted to do, but I wasn't quite sure, well, how do you become an astronaut? We only had 7 American astronauts at that time, and I didn't know any of them. But the one thing I recognized early on was it was going to be difficult. There was a lot of competition. Thousands of people apply to be astronauts, and a small handful are selected. So I knew as a young boy, my only shot of ever making it to space would have to involve me working hard and doing my best in school. And that's what I did every day in all my subjects in math and science, but reading, art, history, music, gym, whatever I worked on, I gave it my best effort. After high school, I went on to college, got my bachelor's degree in physics, one of the sciences. And that's the minimum degree. You need to become an astronaut, a 4-year college degree in math, science, engineering, or the medical field. But again, I knew the competition was going to be tough. So I stayed in college and I got my master's and my doctorate in engineering. So after nearly 10 years of college, I got out. And it was at this point I started applying to NASA to become an astronaut. Now, NASA selects new groups of astronauts every 3 or 4 or 5 years. They'll pick a small group of 10 or 15, depending on their needs. And 2 years after I got out of college, NASA put out that announcement. They needed new astronauts. I was all excited. I wrote to them. I got the application form, filled it out, sent it in. And with great anticipation, they turned me down. They said, no, thanks. I was surprised, but I didn't give up. 2 years later, there was another astronaut selection. I tried a second time, same result. They turned me down. And at this point, I thought, my grandmother and I have the same chance of becoming an astronaut. That chance was zero. I wasn't even getting close in the competition. So I studied carefully the backgrounds of the people that were successful getting into the program to see what do they have that I don't have? Like, what am I missing? And I learned a few things. I learned that, flying experience was really important. It wasn't a requirement, but it really seemed to help. So I started taking flying lessons and I got my pilot's license. I also noticed most of the astronauts that they selected had some parachuting or skydiving experience. So I learned to do that. And I taught a university course. That seemed to be experience NASA was looking for. So I worked on those activities. 3 years later, another astronaut selection. I sent my application in. And this time NASA called me up and they invited me down to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, for a week of medical testing and an interview. And out of the thousands of people that apply, NASA will select 100 individuals. They bring you to Houston and you spend a full week on a really thorough medical exam. And then there's a 1-hour interview. So I passed all the medical exams, went on to the interview. That went extremely well. And I just sat back and waited. And it was, feeling pretty confident about all this because NASA was doing a security background check on me at the time. And I got a call about 2 months ago or 2 months later, and they said, Don, thank you very much for applying. We had a lot of good candidates. We didn't select you, but good luck in the future. And I hung up that phone, and I was just so disappointed, devastated. I thought I had made it in that time, but here they turned me down. And I felt like giving up on this. I worked hard. I was 32 years old at this point and applied 3 times, but clearly NASA didn't want me. And I thought, I'll go to bed, get a good night's sleep. And then in the morning when I wake up, I put together a new plan for my career that did not involve being an astronaut. Well, I went to bed that night. The next morning when I woke up, the very first thought that popped into my head was, I still want to be an astronaut. So I moved down to Houston, Texas, got a job as an engineer at the Johnson Space Center, working on the space shuttle program. Did that for 3 years. Then there was another astronaut selection. Sent my application in. I got called up for the medical testing and interviews once again. And then about 3 months later, I got another phone call from NASA. And this time they said, Don, are you still interested in being an astronaut? Because we'd like to offer you the job. I said yes. I hung up the phone. And for the next 10 minutes, I was jumping up and down, yelling and screaming, because I knew I made it into the program. I would be going into space. I was 35 years old when I got that call, and I started a 4-year training program for my first flight. So the first time I made it to space, I was 39 years old. So it took me a while to get there, but all that hard work really paid off for me. And I went on to fly 4 times on the space shuttle. This is the crew from my last flight, and the last time I was in space was 24 years ago already, aboard Space Shuttle Columbia. We've got 7 astronauts, 2 of them military pilots in the front row with the helmets to help us fly the shuttle. On the left-hand side with the helmet is our commander, Jim Halsell. He was an Air Force test pilot. On the right-hand side with the helmet is our pilot. Her name is Susan Still. And Susan was a pretty unique individual. She's only the second woman to pilot the space shuttle. And Susan's one of our Navy's top fighter pilots. So it was really a great opportunity for me to fly with Susan. And then you probably don't recognize that guy on the far right-hand side, but that's me the way I looked 24 years ago, before gray hair, wrinkles, and a few pounds around the middle. And out of this crew of 7, there's 4 of us on the crew that are frequent visitors down at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex. There's the space shuttle on the launch pad. This is pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. And I went out there the night before my first mission. Was out there about midnight or so, and it was so incredible just to stand there at the base of the space shuttle, looking up at it and just staring up at, the shuttle against the pitch black sky with all those bright lights on it. And as I stood there gazing up at it, I had incredible butterflies in my stomach. A little piece of me was scared. A little piece of me was nervous. But my main emotion was one of great excitement, because I knew 12 hours from when I'm taking this picture, I'm going to be sitting in the nose of the shuttle there blasting off. And I almost couldn't believe where I was and what I was about to do. Well, they bring us out launch morning about 3 hours before liftoff. And there I am in my spacesuit just outside of Space Shuttle Columbia. They strap us into our seat one at a time. So I'm just hanging out here. When it's my turn, they'll call my name and say, hey, Don, we're ready for you. I'll turn that corner to the left, walk down an access arm, and at the end of it there, you see a round hatch or door for the shuttle. Before I climb inside, these 2 gentlemen in the white suits help me put on a parachute. We'll get the helmets on, gloves on. Once everything's all set, I get on my hands and knees, crawl through that hatch, and there's a few people there to help strap us into our seats. We're laying it down on our backs for launch. We've got shoulder harnesses and seat belts on. They strap us in good and tight, because there's a lot of shaking and vibration during launch. You don't want to bounce out of your seat and hurt yourself or damage any equipment. So they strap us in nice and tight. Once that's all done, everybody moves away from us about 3.5 miles. And it gets very quiet inside the shuttle up until 6 seconds before liftoff. At that point, 3 big engines at the tail of the shuttle start coming up to full power. And 6 seconds later, we light those 2 big white side rockets called solid rocket boosters. And the instant they light, boom, immediately you take off. And laying on my back in my seat, I could hear the roar of the engines. I could feel the shaking and vibration going on. And right at that moment of liftoff, I felt a push in my back. And it felt to me just like somebody had their hand right in the middle of my back, just pushing me up into the sky. And that's what the space shuttle's doing, literally pushing us, tossing us up in the air. Down at the Kennedy Space Center today, you can get a pretty good feel for what launch is like on the shuttle launch experience. They'll strap you into your seat. It'll rock and roll. You'll hear the roar of the engines. I tell people the only difference between the shuttle launch experience and the real mission to space is that fear factor. I'm never afraid when I'm down at the Kennedy Space Center now on the shuttle launch experience. But we launch, and then 8.5 minutes later, the engine shut down. It's perfectly quiet, and we're in space. It only takes 8.5 minutes to get to space. That was always amazing to me. And in 8.5 minutes, we're 200 miles above the Earth. And at this point, we're traveling at a speed of 17,500 miles an hour. That turns out to be 5 miles a second. So imagine getting from Orlando to the Kennedy Space Center in only about 10 seconds and no stopping at the toll booths there. So we go so fast that we orbit the Earth. We go all the way around in only an hour and a half. This is Chaki Mukai, the first Japanese woman in space, and I flew with her on my first mission. And in space, you don't walk around like we're used to doing here on Earth. To move around in space, it's just a little push with your finger, and you go sailing through the air like Superman or Superwoman. You start spinning in space, doing a somersault, and you'll go round and round all day until you get tired and you reach out to stop yourself. So we have a lot of fun just floating around in space. This is Susan, our pilot, on my last flight, and she's typing on a laptop computer there. And I want to point out one feature. She's got her toes hooked on that vertical gold pole. And the reason she's doing that, if she didn't pinch that bar with her toes, every time she hit the keyboard on the computer, she would bounce off and go in the opposite direction. But just pinching it a little bit, she can stay in position, float in the air, and type on the computer all day long. And in space, there's no up or down. You know, I think we pretty much agree which way is up and which way is down here on Earth. But in space, there is no up or down. And you know, here on Earth, if you stand on your head, all the blood rushes to your head because of gravity. Well, that doesn't happen in space. In space, you go upside down, you feel totally normal. And in space, wherever your head is pointed, that direction is up for you. Wherever your feet are pointed, that's down. So this is Nancy and Kevin on my second flight. Nancy's looking at Kevin saying, "Hey, Kevin, you're upside down." Well, Kevin's looking right back at her saying, "No, you're upside down." In his little world, she's the one that appears to be upside down. So you never feel like you're upside down in space. It's everybody else in the room. Now in space, our food is all freeze-dried. It's not the most delicious, as you can probably guess, but these are some of the examples of it. This is fully cooked food. They freeze it, remove all the moisture, dry it out, and vacuum pack it in these small plastic containers. Once we get to space, we bring it to a food station, a needle poke in there, and we can inject hot water, cold water, whatever you want, and that dry, hard food will soften up, and after 3 or 4 minutes, it's ready to eat. So I tell people the food is okay. You know, I would never go to a restaurant that was serving space food, but it's okay for your trip to space. And here's our food station on board the space shuttle where you add water to the freeze-dried food. Now, exercise is really important in space. You know, as we walk around all day, you know, we're using our leg muscles, fighting gravity, you're carrying groceries and other things, always using your muscles. While in space, we're just floating around all day. And everything is weightless up there. I can lift your car with one finger in space. So we don't use our muscles, and it's very important exercise. We had a bicycle we'd ride every day on board the space shuttle for about 45 minutes a day. Get your heart muscle going, get your leg muscles working so that when you come back to Earth at the end of the mission, you're still in good shape. Sleeping's a little unusual in space. The inside of the shuttle is pretty small, maybe the size of your kitchen at home, and we didn't have dedicated bedrooms. So when it was time to go to bed, we would just take a sleeping bag, attach it to the wall, and then you float up there, slip inside, zip it up, and you go to bed. We wear the dark eye shades that you see in this picture because we go around the Earth every hour and a half. And we get 45 minutes of daylight, 45 minutes of nighttime. If you don't want the sun coming in your eyes all the time, you need to wear the eye shades there. And for cleaning up in space, we don't have a bathtub, we don't have a shower, we don't even have a sink like you have in your kitchen or bathroom at home. So when it comes time to clean up, we have some of our drink bags that we drink out of, and instead of having powdered juice in them like Tang, you know, a few of these bags will have powdered soap. So we can add hot water, mix up a bag of hot soapy water, we just put it on a washcloth and give ourselves a sponge bath. For washing our hair, we've got a special shampoo that you see here called No Rinse Shampoo. And this stuff was developed for people in the hospital who can't get out of bed to take a shower. It's very easy to use, doesn't require any water. All you do is squirt some of it in your hair, you work up a lather, then you take a towel, pat it dry, and you're done. I took this picture. I love the bottom line on the bottle. It says, "For beautifully clean, full-bodied hair." And I want to share with you what that looks like in space. Here's Susan, our pilot, and anybody with longer hair, it's going to float all over. I'm not picking on Susan here. Even my short hair floats all over. And we say that every day in space is a bad hair day. And that's a pretty accurate statement. I want to share with you the granddaddy of all bad hair days in space. If you're ready for this one, this is Marsha Ivins. She flew on 5 space shuttle missions, had super long hair, as you see here. She wouldn't leave it like this normally. Otherwise, for the rest of us, it'd be like scuba diving through seaweed. She'd put it in a ponytail, but just did this for the picture. And here you see our space toilet aboard the space shuttle. It's in a small closet area, very similar to an airline toilet. We've got a curtain that goes across the front like a shower curtain for privacy. And at the center of the picture there, you see a white toilet seat like our toilets on Earth. But here on Earth, we use gravity to collect the waste material, right? You could probably imagine what would happen in zero gravity in space. And we're not going to talk about that here this afternoon. But this toilet is like a porta potty. You may see at a football game or a construction site. And in the bowl part of the toilet, we have giant fans. And to activate the toilet, there's a little knob off to the side. You just push that knob. It activates these fans, and it sucks the air from the toilet seat downward. So we use that down rush of air to kind of act like gravity to keep waste material down, keep it from floating all over. And that's the secret of the space toilet. I want to share with you some pictures of the Earth. And whenever an astronaut has a free moment, we would float to the window to watch the Earth go by. I've got a map in my hand here. I'm trying to figure out where we are around planet Earth. And I'm looking out one of the windows towards the tail end of the space shuttle. And I took a camera right up to that window. I pressed it against a glass and took a picture so you can see exactly what my eyes are seeing. And this is the view you see out the back. And there you have the beautiful blue Earth from 200 miles above. All the blue in this image is the Pacific Ocean. The white areas are puffy clouds. That peninsula coming down from the upper right-hand corner, that's Baja California there. So my favorite part of this picture, if you look carefully at the bottom edge of the Earth, either to the right or to the left of the space shuttle, you may see a little thin, like a paper-thin blue line at the bottom edge of the Earth. And what you're looking at in that little blue line, that is our atmosphere. On a nice sunny day in Florida where it's always sunny there, you look up at that blue sky and it looks like it goes on forever and ever. From space, we see the atmosphere edge on. And it looks just like you see here. It looks like a paper-thin layer. And it just makes you appreciate how fragile planet Earth is. Here's a hurricane. I saw many storms when I was up there. This was a big one over the Pacific Ocean, about 400 miles across. And we passed right over the center of the storm. That's called the eye. And we were able to look straight down right into the eye to see the Pacific Ocean down below. It was really awesome to be looking into the hurricane that you see here. And here's a volcano venting steam. This is in the South Pacific near Indonesia. On the left-hand side, near the center of the picture, you see another volcanic crater, half underwater there. And here you see the Himalaya Mountains. And right at the very center, that is Mount Everest. Now, I can sit here in front of you this afternoon and tell you without lying, I have seen the top of Mount Everest with my own eyes about 25 times during my missions. I call it the lazy man's way to see the top of Mount Everest. So I've seen the top of Mount Everest many times. I've seen the Great Barrier Reef off Australia, the Amazon rainforest down in Brazil and South America. I've seen Mount Kilimanjaro, big volcanic peak in Africa poking up through the clouds. So many amazing sights around planet Earth. And here's a beautiful shot of Florida, the great state of Florida here. Just spectacular. Whenever we would fly over Florida, you'd have all the astronauts. We'd have our noses pressed up against the window looking out. And right there on the East Coast in Central Florida, there is a Kennedy Space Center. Always one of the favorite views for the astronauts. I remember on my first mission, we were just about an hour and 20 minutes into the mission, and I looked out the window and I saw Tampa Bay. So I knew we were coming up on Florida. So I stayed at the window, and 2 minutes later, we're passing over the Kennedy Space Center. And I said to myself, wow, I can't believe this. I have just been around the Earth in an hour and a half, and I knew my family was still stuck in traffic down there waiting to get back to their hotels in Cocoa Beach. And if you like nightlife, if you're looking for a nightlife, you got to come to Florida here. This is the view from space of Florida. And let me put a few cities in here just to show some of the great destinations from Jacksonville, Daytona, Orlando, Kennedy Space Center, Miami, and then on the West Coast, Tampa, St. Pete, Sarasota, Cape Coral, Naples. Those are just some of the many great, great cities in the state of Florida. You can even see part of the Keys there at the very bottom right-hand corner of the picture, but just spectacular. Great nightlife down in Florida. And here you see a sunrise from space. Because we go around the Earth every hour and a half, we see 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every 24-hour day up there. And they're all spectacular. I would try to catch as many of these as I could every day in space. Well, at the end of the mission, it would be time for us to come home. We'd fire 2 engines at the back of the shuttle, and it would slow our speed down just a few hundred miles an hour. But we would begin our fall back to Earth, and about 55 minutes later, we would end up landing right back at the Kennedy Space Center, just a few miles from our launch pad. Touching down like an airplane, we would deploy a big drag parachute out the back and then put the brakes on and just roll to a stop. And then we just sit in our seats and wait for them to open the hatch. And typically it would take them about an hour before they'd open the hatch and we could get out. When you first come back from space, you feel like you weigh about 1,000 pounds because you've been floating around weightless for 2 weeks. And then suddenly you come back to this pull of gravity. And it just felt so heavy for me. My arms were heavy, my legs were heavy. I was a little dizzy when I got back. And it took a day or so for that dizziness to go away, and maybe a week or so to get your muscle strength back. And then you're pretty much back to normal. So this picture was taken 2 hours after I landed on my first flight. That's me there on the left. On the right-hand side is my commander, Bob Cabana, who's currently the center director at the Kennedy Space Center. And after we took this picture, I turned around, I looked up at Columbia, and I thought, what an amazing vehicle this is. This was my house in space for 2 weeks. This thing protected me from that fiery reentry coming in through the atmosphere. And then one of the next thoughts that popped into my head was, I got to do this again. It's like going on one of those going to one of the attractions in Orlando or elsewhere in Florida. You're on one of those great roller coasters and you get off the ride and immediately you want to run around, get back in line and do it again. And that is exactly how I felt. As soon as I landed on my first mission, I thought, I got to do this again. And I went on to fly a total of 4 missions. So the space shuttles, they're all retired. 10 years ago was the last mission of our space shuttles. And today you can see them in museums, and down at the Kennedy Space Center, we have Space Shuttle Atlantis. And you could get closer to Atlantis than I am to Columbia here. You can almost reach out and touch it. We ask people not to do that, but you can get that close to it to really get a good view of, how huge the space shuttle is. And Atlantis flew on 33 missions. And you can see the discoloration, the burning, as it's coming in through the atmosphere. It's quite emotional, moving to see these in person. Today, we still have the International Space Station orbiting overhead, about 250 miles up. We currently have 7 astronauts on board, 4 Americans, 2 Russians, and then a Japanese astronaut. And just in November, we had the Falcon, SpaceX's Falcon 9 Crew Dragon launched from the Kennedy Space Center, from the same launch pad that I launched on, from the same launch pad that Neil Armstrong launched to the moon back in 1969. We're launching astronauts today via SpaceX up to the International Space Station. And today, NASA's working on a brand new rocket called the Space Launch System, SLS. These will be the biggest, most powerful rockets ever built and launched. And instead of flying our astronauts in space shuttles, they'll be in capsules called the Orion. Our first test launch of this new rocket is called the Artemis 1 mission, and the first test launch is about a year away. And what NASA's going to do on that mission, they're going to launch it unmanned, so no astronauts on this first flight. They're going to send it to the moon, orbit the moon for 2 weeks, and come back to Earth. And if everything works well on that first flight, we're going to put astronauts on the very next mission, Artemis 2, and send them in orbit around the moon. And then in 2024, so we're talking just 4 years from now, we're going to do the Artemis 3 mission. And that is going to land 2 astronauts down at the South Pole of the moon. 50 years ago, we landed 12 Americans on the moon. They were all men. And this mission, just 4 years away, we're going to land the first woman on the moon and also the next man. Just 4 years away from the first woman on the moon. I think that's incredibly exciting. I know I'm going to be one to be down at the Kennedy Space Center to watch that launch as they leave for the moon. So where are we going with these new rockets and capsules? I mentioned the moon. We'd also like to visit the asteroids, and we're looking at that red planet Mars out there. And this is an artist's drawing of a mission to Mars. About 20 years from now, we hope to land astronauts on the surface of Mars. And here you see the landing craft, and just to the right of it, you see the shadowy figure of the first 2 humans to set foot on Mars. And those 2 astronauts you see in this image, it's not this generation of astronauts. Those 2 astronauts you see walking on the surface of Mars are these astronauts. These are the young students that visit us at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex. And, we have our Lunch with an Astronaut program there where we get to meet them and share our experiences. And these are our next generation of scientists, engineers, technicians, and astronauts. And this picture just takes me back to that very first picture I showed you of me as a little boy. This is what we do at the Kennedy Space Center. We inspire that next generation. So we want young students to come to the Kennedy Space Center and try the shuttle launch experience and see what we're doing and visit our Mars galleries and get a feel, because I want them excited just like I got excited as a young boy to go into space myself. And we always tell these students, we need you. I told you we're building these new rockets today. We're designing new spacesuits at NASA and habitats for Mars. But we're going to need our next generation of scientists, engineers, and astronauts ready. And that's why it's so important to get our young students excited. Some final pictures here. This is the launch tower for the new Space Launch System rocket that'll be launching next year. This is the picture I took there about 2 years ago as they were still, getting it under construction, getting it ready for launch. And down in the lower left-hand corner there, you see a banner on the launch platform. And it says, "The journey to Mars begins here." And when I saw that, I had chills run down me, because this is the launch pad that we're going to send the first woman to the moon, just 4 years. This is the launch pad we're going to send these young students 20 years from now on their way to Mars. And it's just so exciting to come to the Kennedy Space Center. This is where it's happening. You can see a lot of history and a lot of our future of what we're doing there.